If you see me walking down a dangerous road, would you stop me and say, sister, you're going the wrong way? Or if you see me carry a heavy load, would you stop and say, sister, I'll help you along your way? You are my brother, I may not know where you're from. You are my sister, I don't care where you're from. There's only one race, and that's the human race. White man, black man, whatever, one human race. Why would you leave me with a heavy load? Leave me on a dangerous road just because my color is not the same like yours. Why would you leave me with a heavy load?
One human race indeed. Dear listeners and viewers, hello and welcome to our weekly meeting through your program, Spectra. Canada is a very multicultural country, and every year we have hundreds of thousands of new immigrants coming to Canada. Some of them are skilled workers, others refugees, some are entrepreneurs, investors, etc., etc. But now, like with people coming from all four corners of the globe, and with the changes that are happening around us everywhere in the world, there are some very important and pressing questions that came to the surface lately. First and foremost, are the Canadian immigration and citizenship laws on the right track? And if not, what needs to be changed? And what kind of amendments are we looking for? Again, is Canada a melting pot, or is it just a salad bowl? And how many people are really living multiculturalism? These questions and more will be the topic of today's episode. And I'm really delighted to be accompanied in the studio tonight by Robert Young.
How do you do?
It's a pleasure having you. And Robert is a lawyer, and he's specialized in immigration, citizenship, and refugees affairs. It's a great honor to have you with us tonight.
Thank you.
And to start off, Robert, who is an immigrant?
Oh, well, my definition's very narrow. Of course, it's someone who's been born outside of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
After that point, if you're born here, even if your parents had just arrived yesterday, certainly you're a citizen. And, you know, that's just a technical definition, because I meet many people who've been here for many, many years, and they are, to my, in my heart, they're certainly Canadians. I met a young woman today from India. I could not tell her accent from anyone from North York.
Mm-hmm.
And her attitudes were Indian. She's Muslim, but she would not been out of place anywhere, certainly in Markham or North York or Etobicoke or North Bay for that matter. She was indistinguishable.
Okay, so not out of place. And so immigration patterns have definitely changed a lot over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And during the 1970s and 1980s, there was a big change towards multiculturalism. And, charter of, rights and freedoms, and, having, multiculturalism as part and parcel of the Canadian fabric and constitution.
Immigration was very color biased back then, because there's an emphasis on bringing European migrants.
Mm-hmm.
And so someone from the Indian subcontinent, someone from Asia, they were discouraged. And I think It was indeed during the 1970s that they tried to make it an entirely colorblind system. So they looked at family relationships and skills in education. Before those changes, it was quite biased, quite racist.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, like today we talk about people like Marianne Chad, like Viola Desmond and whatnot. And like someone like Viola Desmond is like, she achieved an official apology, and, you know, she's in the, you know,
I've got her picture in my wallet right now.
Yeah, perfect. $10 bill. And, you know, because she was fighting racism and whatnot. But some people would argue today that the only difference between the time of Viola Desmond and today is just the difference between a subtle and an overt kind of racism. How correct or incorrect is this statement?
Well, I can't really talk about racism. I know that I was born in Canada. My family are from Northern Europe, mainly the British Isles. My family's been here for at least 130 years. My wife's family's been here even longer. She's the same background. But I know from growing up, to say something racist, it was quite common back then. Now it's considered the height of rudeness. Everyone recoils if you do something like that, if it's that overt.
Yeah.
So I can't really speak about racism, but I know among polite society, it's just not accepted.
In the overt manner, but how about in the subtle one?
I can't speak to that.
Okay.
I can't speak to that. Sorry, that's not my area. No.
Okay, but like some people might argue, it is still there. And then we come to the very important question. To what extent is Canada a melting pot or a salad bowl?
Maybe I can answer that indirectly by talk about how people come to Canada.
Yeah.
Because I'm an immigration lawyer. That's what I've been doing for over 30 years.
Sure.
The Canadian system has to balance, I think, 3 criteria. There's a limit to how much any society can absorb. You look at the crisis that is going on in, say, Lebanon, where more than 1 out of 4 people are from outside of Lebanon. And the culture is very similar, but these are refugees from Syria and Iraq.
Yeah.
And the Lebanese society is creaking. It's tearing apart just because of the pressure of having all these people from outside. There is a maximum that any society can take. In Canada, the federal government has decided the replacement rate or the immigration rate is going to be about 1%. There's about 38, 39 million Canadians, and they're bringing in about 340, 350,000 immigrants. So once you decide on a level how many people are going to bring in, typically a system will balance between 3 factors. One is they have to recognize that there's going to be family members. People will meet other people, fall in love, and have children. And that's something we want to encourage. It's always been that way. And we also have a refugee, a compassionate system too. And that's in every society. There's room for helping the widow, helping the orphan, helping the stranger at our door who's asking for help. And I think that has more to do with how Canadians look at themselves. Who do we let come into Canada? Any society that doesn't welcome a stranger who's come to us in that aspect, it's a terrible society. It's a self-loathing society. And then there's a component where Canada says, who do we need? Who do we need that's going to be good for Canada? And are we going to let them stay temporarily and exploit their knowledge and their youth and their energy, or are we going to let them stay forever because of their skills? And so a lot of it has to do with how do you come to Canada, but it's going to be through one of those 3 routes. And Canada right now has a fairly generous policy towards family reunification. If I have a spouse or even a common law partner, which in many societies is frowned on, or children under a certain age, I can bring them here. I think that's why would they not be Canadians? Why would they not be our friends? Why would they not be our neighbors? And why would a refugee not be our friend or neighbor, our future citizen, someone who comes.
Okay, so, you know, throughout this hour, like, I will not be necessarily displaying or like, you know, speaking my mind, my personal mind out, but I'm always playing, you know, the devil's advocate.
Sure.
I'm always representing the other side. So another person might say, okay, like compassion. Compassion is a great thing. It's a virtue for sure. You know, like, having feelings for other people's, you know, misfortunes, opening your door for them, etc. That's great. But I think, again, like if I'm opening my doors to someone and he is my guest, like they shouldn't tell me that, you know, you guys go to bed too late or too early. You know, he's the guest, so he should get accustomed to our way of living here. But no, like it's not enough that we're hosting him or her, but they would say, no, we don't like the food you're eating. We don't like, you know, the clothes you're putting on. We don't like the time you wake up and whatnot. This is an argument that some people would say about refugees, for instance.
That they have to become like me.
Yeah,
Someone
like
with
assimilate.
a Northern European Protestant, they have to become like me.
Again, yeah, like that's one point of view. Again, the other people might tell you, like, why don't they become like the mainstream? Yeah, whatever that may be.
Well, the mainstream has changed since I was a kid. I was born in 1960, and Canada was pretty homogeneous back then. The big division then was French and English,
Okay.
which now is laughable. Before that, the big division was between Protestant and Catholic, and again, that's laughable by modern standards. And I think that Canadians are finding accommodation with different cultures, different ideas, different religions. It's been my experience that people have, when they come here, they do, like a refugee really all he or she wants is to be left alone. I've dealt with hundreds, if not thousands, of refugees in my career, and they just want a chance to have a job, be self-sufficient, raise their kids, put their kids in school, buy a house, grow old and die just like anyone else. And they just want to be left alone. And I've rarely heard of one of my refugee clients getting into trouble. Now, there is screening procedures. Some of the people who come here as refugees are very, very bad people. And for the most part, they are caught, people with human rights violations in the background. But most of the people I've met have not rocked the boat and have made contributions. I've dealt, like, nowadays we often look at it through the lens of Islam and people from the Middle East, but there's also people coming from the Far East who have accommodated to Canada, and Canadians have accommodated to them, and people have come from Central and South America. That's a huge component of this region.
Of course.
And have just blended in. Blended in as in, it's not that they've turned the same color as everyone else, it's the fact that it's like mixing paint together. You've blended all these different colors and you get a different color paint. So salad bowl or melting pot, I'm on the melting pot side mainly because I think with enough time we are finding common grounds. And in a city like Toronto, you see it a lot. North Bay, maybe it's a little different, it hasn't hit them yet, but around here I think we are moving towards a melting pot. This is an anecdote. This is from several years ago. I was in Toronto for Pride weekend. And I normally go to Toronto for work. I don't come as a tourist, but my wife was down here for work and I came to meet her. And walking up Yonge Street, and there was a family, 3 generations from East India, or from East Asia, Indian people. There's grandma, there's the adult parents, and there's the children. And obviously they're showing grandma around Toronto. And there was 2 fellows walking towards them, holding hands.
From the Pride community.
From the Pride community.
Yeah.
And everyone was just smiling and happy to be there. At that moment, I actually felt proud to be in Toronto. because everyone was just, it's a lovely day, and everyone was just happy to be in each other's company and weren't stepping on each other's toes. Now that may be an overly optimistic viewpoint, but because I know that communities do have trouble at the beginning.
Definitely, you know, like you just mentioned the Pride community, and just to talk about LGBTQ, or like the Pride, is it's an abomination for some cultures and that are living here. And a lot of people would go out on riots and say, like, how are you allowing things like that?
It's not even LGBTQ. I remember years ago, a man from Saudi Arabia explaining how offensive he found lingerie commercials. He could not believe that this was being exhibited. It was just extremely offensive to him.
How can people, display their underwears? Like, that's the way he saw it.
And you know what? He had a point.
So the point here again is how to deal with all of these huge, you know, like discrepancies here. So you have some people, because you have a Canadian Constitution, and the Canadian Constitution, like, it's part and parcel of the Canadian Constitution, is freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of belief, etc., etc., etc. So, like the Pride community, like their rights is part and parcel of the Canadian Constitution. The same rights that allow them to practice their rights and, like, you know, to expose themselves, is the same right that allows a religious person to go to their place of worship freely. You can't pick and choose. Either take it all or you leave it all. But lately, some people have been saying, no, we want this part, but not that part.
But they're not understanding what a liberal democracy is. Because a liberal democracy creates boundaries, that there is behavior that is acceptable and there's behavior that is unacceptable. And there is a boundary. You are not to interfere with someone else's right to practice their religion. You are not to...
or gender. Or anything.
Gender.
Anything,
But anything that doesn't overstep those boundaries is permitted. And that's probably the strength for Canada, is that you have all this activity going on within these boundaries. As long as you're not harming someone else, you're allowed to do what you want. It's not that there are certain things that are allowed. The boundaries say there are certain things that are prohibited and everything else is allowed.
But, you know, a lot of people, again, would argue today that Canada's no more than a group of ethnic silos. You know, okay, because you have this freedom of expression, and as long as, you know, I'm not stepping on your toes, you're not stepping on mine, so you're free to practice and do whatever you want. Same thing for me. So, you know what? I'll go to work with you. Okay, I'll accept to be your subordinate, or like you to be your boss, or to be your coworker. I can go to school with you. But guess what? When I go back home, I'm not interested a bit in inviting you to my house, and you're not interested in inviting me to yours as well. So where do we go after that? Like, are we going to have just like these, you know, separate islands here, like these silos, these self-made ghettos?
I have three things to say about that.
Sure.
One is, there's always been a theory in Canadian political science about the vertical mosaic. That, and this goes back to when it was just split between Francophones and Anglophones, that most Anglophones and Francophones had their own private life and they would only meet at the elite level. Second, I think that people do, with enough time, because in my age, in my time, I have seen communities merge. It used to be a big thing. You never played with the Italian kids. You never played with the Portuguese kids, and it's just laughable now. And I think as people just simply grow up together, this will just disappear. I think of my son, who has friends from all communities. My son, by the way, is genetically Indian, East Indian. Yeah, and so is my daughter. So in my case, that argument doesn't work, because my home, well, there are East Indians in my home. genetically.
Yeah.
Every molecule in their body is actually from Canada. The other thing is, you may be talking about something that's very characteristic of Canadians. I once had a client say to me, a Canadian will be polite to you, a Canadian will take you out for coffee, but there's always a door with a lock on it that they'll never open for you. Canadians are very reticent, very, very quiet, and they don't open the door. And most cultures are like that, but we don't open the door freely. A lot of societies, they do embrace you.
Yeah.
And as a Canadian, I can tell you, I've won refugee hearings, and I've had clients come up and cover me with kisses, hugging me. That is deeply embarrassing. I don't hug anyone. So that's just a cultural thing.
I understand.
For us who are born here.
So, but you don't see that like Canada, because, you know, recently in France, about a year ago, there was a very controversial book that was published. It was called The French Archipelago.
Okay.
And a lot of people are like afraid that one day we'll have the Canadian archipelago as well. So we all are Canadians. We took the oath. Yeah, okay. We're living on the same land, under the same sky, but in separate islands.
I'm going to get this story wrong. I'm from Hamilton, and Hamilton's very blue collar. And there's a shopping mall in Hamilton called Jackson Square. If anyone knows the band The Arkells, their first album, Jackson Square, it's named after that. And so some young men, I don't know whether or not they were part of McMaster University or Mohawk, wanted to prove that Hamiltonians were racist. I've seen this video. So at a main bus stop in front of Jackson Square, they had a man dressed in typical Pakistani clothing.
Yeah.
Lining up, and they had a guy dressed in hoser clothing. That's a flannel shirt and jean pants. And they're all in on it. They're filming it. And the guy in the flannel shirt and the jean pants was harassing the other man.
Okay.
The other man was clearly Pakistani or Muslim. And the interesting thing was their little test or experiment backfired on them, or turned around. All the people, all the European ancestry people in the bus line started to yell at the man who was harassing the man in the Pakistani garb. Yeah. And eventually someone punched the man who was yelling at the Pakistani man. Now that's very much a Hamilton reaction.
Yeah.
But I think you have to give us more credit for that. That we may not. We
absolutely.
May,
yeah. And I think it, and again, like, please correct me if I'm wrong. It doesn't matter if we're talking about white collar or blue collar here, but yeah, like Canadians would generally like, you know, fight anything that seems to be clearly racist.
Yeah.
But again, how many % of those people who defended this supposedly Pakistani person are ready to have him as their family friend? How many people are ready to invite him to their house?
That's true.
And how many of those Pakistani people are ready to invite the others to their house? Because people are saying that, you know, like Canadians have dual identities. So you have an identity at work. In school, you work with everyone, you invite everyone. But when it comes to private life, the only people that you would really confide in and invite your home are people from your same cultural background. They don't have to be from the same like ethnic group, but from the same general cultural background. Like, so they sort of drink what you drink, eat what you eat, sort of dress what you dress. If not, probably it will be so hard for them to become friends.
But isn't it enough that we meet in the public sphere? Do we have to go the extra distance? Isn't it enough that in a coffee room at a workplace, we have a coffee and we share sweets?
Yeah.
Or that our children go to school together, or we sit beside each other in university and our friends in that context. That in most culture, in many societies, like I deal with refugees,
yeah,
where the difference can be entirely imagined. The shape of someone's skull is allegedly, or having an extra vowel on your name, and you end up fighting. Yeah. Isn't it enough that we can sit down and sit on a bus together, go to work together? Like, that's a big victory compared to a lot of the planet.
Definitely, yeah. But like, everybody's looking for perfection here. And so, yeah, we can go to work together. We can have a cooler talk,
Yeah.
but again, what like the real hot stuff happens at home. And we don't share the hot stuff together. We don't share the controversial discussions.
I'm terrible for anecdotes, but the Protestant church I go to, right after 9/11, they were trying to reach out to the Islamic community. They were trying to, the minister at the time was trying to make the point that we're all people of the book. It's not about what separates us, it's the commonality. Like the Quran uses the word charity. How many hundred times? 400 times? 500 times? I forget.
Yeah.
So he knew that I knew people in the Muslim community, and I invited an imam to come and speak to the church. He couldn't make it, so he sent his substitute who I'd never met before.
Okay.
And afterwards, I invited him and his wife to lunch at my home. And my wife was running around Hamilton trying to find halal meat. At that time, there weren't many places that sold halal. She knew kosher style, because we had many Jewish friends.
Yeah.
She knew, but to get halal meat, and she was just desperate. Finally, she found some. Well, it turned out the imam was a blonde Ukrainian guy from Winnipeg. And when he came to the house, my wife could do kosher style, but she baked sweets. She'd baked like an apple pie. She'd done her, and he said, "Oh, thank goodness, my wife is Indonesian, and just to have a pie again. I'm so happy." But I don't know what the answer is. I really don't know what the answer is.
Thank you very much for this example, because this is a typical example of stereotypes.
Yeah.
So people have a stereotype, and usually stereotypes are created at home. Like when I'm sitting with my family and I'm talking about some people that I don't know, so usually I would create a stereotype. I'd have a mold in my head, and I say that this pigeonhole is for this group, and it's more comfortable, to just group people. But I think if we would go to each other's homes and talk openly about things, then we can sort of come up with a true Canadian identity. Do you think today we really have a Canadian identity at all?
The fact we're having this conversation, I think, is part of it.
Yeah.
Do you know of any other culture that agonizes over something like this? I cannot think of one.
That's great. That's a beautiful thing. But again, how many % of Canadians from different cultural backgrounds are ready to have this open discussion? That's the question here, without being, without the fear of offending someone or being offended.
No, that's true. I think that's one reason why Canadians don't have this conversation, because it is so easy to offend. You do not know, especially in Canada, to give the example of that Ukrainian descent imam from Winnipeg. You never know who is beside you. You never know what their background is, and you know how easy it is to offend. And that's maybe why we don't have that conversation, because we don't want to hurt someone's feelings.
So do you think that more education is in order, for the Canadian population about each other's cultures?
Federal government's been doing that for decades, and so has the provincial government.
Yeah,
tell me how that's worked.
But do you think maybe we need more of this? We might need more of this, more open discussions, more roundtable meetings.
Well, to look at it from my lens again as an immigration lawyer, I know that is something that the government offers, is acclimatization sessions. When you become a permanent resident, they do offer little seminars, sort of an introductory seminar on what it means to be Canadian, things to do, things not to do, things that are illegal, things that are not perhaps gender sensitive. And they do it again with the citizenship test and all the different criteria in the citizenship test.
Yeah.
They do emphasize what they call Canadian values. I could not tell you what a Canadian value is. I honestly could not, except maybe for tolerance. I do not know what a Canadian value is.
Because, like, who is a Canadian? Who is a Canadian? Is it like someone who's just born here, or someone who believes in the Canadian values that people would study to apply for citizenship, the Canadian values that are found in the, the charter, in the Constitution? Like, who is a Canadian? Is he like an Anglophone, a Francophone, an Aboriginal? Like, who is a Canadian? This is a very important question.
Someone who goes and beats up a family, I hope, is not a Canadian, and they could have been born here. It could have been here for 5 generations or 10 generations. I don't know who's a Canadian. I can tell you what the Citizenship Act says, but I don't know who's a Canadian. I have no idea.
So this remains a real enigma here. Like, who is a Canadian?
Who we are has been changing. As I said, this is a very different country than what I grew up in. It's a very different country than what my parents experienced and their parents experienced, from what I've heard. To get back to racism, my dad was a terrible anti-Semite. Just a terrible anti-Semite. And I'm embarrassed to say this publicly, but he would say things, hateful things, without blinking. Without blinking at all. And just to think on them, it's rather shocking. Whereas Jewish people are just part of my background. I've had many Jewish friends. I've had business partners who are Jewish.
Yeah.
But it's not something that you seek out. It's just you know someone after a while. I go, oh, you're Jewish. I didn't realize that.
Okay.
Or you're a Muslim. I didn't realize that. Just like I didn't know that some people like watching CFL football versus NHL hockey. It's just part of the background.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's go for a short break. Don't go away.
Human race. If you see me walking down a dangerous road, would you stop me and say, sister, you're going the wrong way? Or if you see me carry a heavy load, would you stop and say, sister, I'll help you along your way? You are my brother, I may not know where you're from. You are my sister, I don't care where you're from. There's only one race, and that's the human race. White man, black man, whatever, one human race. Why would you leave me with a heavy load? Leave me on a dangerous road just because my color is not the same like yours. Why would you leave me with a heavy load? Leave me on a dangerous road just because my country is not the same like yours. You are my brother, I may not know where you're from. You are my sister, I don't care where you're from. There's only one race, and that's the human race. White man, black man, whatever, one human race. Why would you leave me with a heavy load? Leave me on a dangerous road just because my color is not the same like yours. Why would you leave me with a heavy load? Leave me on a dangerous road just because my country is not the same like yours. But you are my brother, I may not know where you're from.
Would you leave me on a dangerous road because my country is not like yours? That's a good question here. And going back, talking about your area of expertise, which is immigration and citizenship laws, do you think there are some flaws in the system, things that needs to be amended or like corrected?
Oh goodness, yes. Yeah, that has been a concern of mine for years. When I started doing immigration 30 plus years ago, there was a lot that I would not do.
Mm-hmm.
The system was much simpler then. It was much easier for an educated or literate is a better word, person who had someone helping them with things to navigate through the system. The system, for example, spousal sponsorship. If you wanted to sponsor a spouse, you'd phone me up. How do I do it? And I would say, go down to the immigration office.
Mm-hmm.
They have the packages behind the counter. There's normally 3 staff there. You know, Zara's great, Bill's great, Mary's great. Any one of them will tell you how to do it. And I would have nothing to do with it. It was simple. It was a simple.
An immigration office, yeah.
And
that
you
was
could go
there
in and walk, yeah.
time, yeah.
And the officers were very, very compassionate. And they were helpful. But since then, the number of staff immigration has been hiring has dropped.
Mm-hmm.
In absolute terms, there's probably less people working in immigration than when I started. And at the same time, the system has become much more complex.
Mm-hmm.
There's more forms, there's more regulations. I have a 1990 copy of the Immigration Act at my office, and it's sort of a parlor trick for clients when they want to say, they're saying, why is this so hard? I'll put the 1991 beside the 2021. And the 1991 is maybe 40 to 45% as thick as the 2020 Immigration Act.
Wow, okay.
And the 2021, it's fine. The type is much more fine. And those extra rules are not there to make it easier. I think of processes like coming in as an economic migrant, like as a skilled worker. Very, very complicated now. It's probably, from my viewpoint, 2.5 to 3 times more paperwork than it was in the 1990s. Coming as a refugee, there's been so many exclusions put in. So many doors have been closed, so many ways that they've been intercepted overseas. It's less likely for them to come in. For example, last year, the Trudeau government said that anyone who'd made a refugee claim in Australia, New Zealand, US, or the United Kingdom, prior to coming here, can't make a refugee claim here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Even though their systems, especially the American refugee systems, very different than ours, much, much harsher. Some people simply cannot claim anymore under Mr. Trump's government. So I think the hallmarks of a good legal system are simplicity, predictability, our system's not predictable, and transparency. Our system is not transparent. And a lot of it is just because funding has been cut back, the number of officers, number of people running the system are less, and it's should be a self-financing system. If you're coming to Canada, you're paying a lot of money as filing fees.
Yeah.
And no one has actually gone in there and simply drained the swamp. No one has gone in. I think the system needs to be shut down in its entirety and go back to first principles. Who do we want here? And as I said at the beginning, there has to be an upper limit. There has to be numbers. But there are ways to do the numbers. You can say, we're only allowing spouses and children under a certain age, which they do now, and that system seems to work.
Yeah.
When it comes to economic migrants, you can say, you can make it a little harder. We need a little more work experience. We need a little more education. We need a little better skills in languages, but there's ways to make it transparent so someone doesn't approach the system, file an application, waste years of their life, which has happened. There was one point where the immigration system threw out over 250,000 applications because they've been sitting in filing cabinets for 6 years, 7 years, 8 years.
So what you're talking about now is a form of, like, you were looking for a filter or a sieve.
Yep.
At the very beginning.
We always have to have a sieve.
And a sieve at the very, very beginning.
Yep.
So, and the sieve would have very, very tiny holes, you know, like.
It depends on who you want. You have to make,
Okay.
there's 7.8 billion people on the planet, and less than 40 million of them are Canadians. There's a limit to what Canada can absorb.
Because, you know, the counter argument here, a lot of people will say that the reason the system became much more harsh, and, you know, like, and is because a lot of people have abused the system before. They've exploited the system. A lot of people that we have nowadays even are still exploiting the system, making stories up. A very famous story, game that a lot of people would played until the 1990s is that they would just come here, spend the summer vacation in Canada, and then 3 years later they'd apply for citizenship, and there you go. They have the passport. So, and which was extremely unfair compared to other people who gave everything up and really believe in themselves to be Canadian, came to stay here for good. And at the end of the day, both of them get the citizenship, some with a lot of sacrifices, others with none. And once they take the passport, they go again to the place where they are, and they just go ask for a double salary or triple salary because we're Canadians now.
Every legal system can be gamed because we're dealing with people.
Yeah.
Every legal system can be gamed. And a lot of the complexity in the present immigration system is to prevent gaming, and it hasn't worked. Like, for example, you have to take a language test if you're applying as an economic migrant. Even if you have a degree in English from a university in London and were born in the United Kingdom. Every time the immigration bureaucracy makes it more complicated, the cheats find a way around it. I can tell you that from experience.
There are always loopholes.
There's always ways to cheat it.
Yeah.
But what you do too, though, is when you make it more complicated, is you screen out decent, good people who can't navigate the ever more complex system. I should not say that because that's how I pay my mortgage.
Yeah.
I know I'm like a character in Harry Potter. I say the magical incantation and get it right. Someone else would say it and their wand would explode, they'd turn into a cat. But I don't think that's the way we should do it. Another problem is in Canada, there's not enough enforcement officers. So they've set the standards very high because they don't police within Canada. And I'm not blaming the officers themselves, the frontline officers. I think that they're asked to do too much. I think it's a problem of not enough resources being allocated, because I don't have a problem with someone who comes here, maybe make the threshold a little lighter. And if they come here and live their life and they contribute, they're my neighbor, they're my fellow citizen, I'm fine with that. But if they go bad, I want someone who's going to kick them out quickly. But those people don't exist. Those resources don't exist right now. But yeah, there are people who game the system. I know that. And
some people would say the system is just too lenient. So I come in and as a refugee, and then like for them to decide like whether I deserve this or not, I'm staying for a long time here, and then I have a baby who's a Canadian baby, etc., etc. And there you go. Like I'm here. I'm here for good.
I have heard the stories. I have heard the lies. I've sat there for hour after hour listening to the lies. But refugees are different, qualitatively different than a family sponsorship or an economic migrant, because their experiences, if even 5% of them are telling the truth, their experiences are they're just horrifying. And I'm content that, yeah, we let a few through who are telling a story, rather than send that person who's told me about being tortured or seeing their family killed.
Yeah, the honest one.
The honest one. I would rather take the hit and have 3 or 4 or 9 come through who I know are just going to get a job and settle into Canada and grow old and die. As long as they're not causing problems, I'm content to let them in, because I don't want that person who experienced that trauma to go through it again. That's just the price of a refugee system.
And another thing that some people might argue against again is the level of English language. So the the level of proficiency of English language that is required for you to apply for citizenship is a listening for and speaking for, according to Canadian language benchmarks. And a lot of people would wonder, like, how can someone with a level 4 become a citizen of any country in the world? Like, you know, because if I tell you that I'm Chinese, but my Chinese is extremely rusty and I have a very heavy tongue speaking Chinese, you'd never believe me. But anyone can claim that they're Canadian. Like,
well, level 4 allows you to get by. It allows you to order a meal in a restaurant. It allows you to work in a work setting. And I grew up with Italian and Portuguese kids and Dutch kids, and I would go to have dinner at their home. I remember one man in particular, Mr. Montini. He barely spoke English, and the only thing we agreed on was Mrs. Montini's gnocchi was the best in the world, because we would fight over it, and then we would laugh. But my point is level 4, if you can get away with going to a restaurant or going into a store or working, isn't that enough? That's enough to get by.
But is it enough for you to interact with people and understand the culture and, you know, have any kind of intellectual, like, you know, discourse or like conversation?
But I don't need that to recognize them as fellow Canadians. I know they're my neighbor. I know, you know.
But how can we interact? Like, how can you and I interact if we don't have a medium of interaction?
Well, Mr. Montini and I onse came to blows over the gnocchi. It was just play acting, but we once came to blows. There are nonverbal ways to communicate. I don't have a problem with level 4, because to make it any higher, you're disqualifying some people who are very comfortable here, who have settled into the community. Often you'll have, say, a woman who's been isolated in her home culture. Okay. Maybe not literate in her home culture. And for her to learn English to a level 4 it takes her a lot of effort.
Of course.
And I'm proud that she made it to a level 4. You know, that I know that often it takes several years of going to ESL classes to reach that point. But,
you know, like, shouldn't there be like more checking on this point here? And again, some, like, you know, probation period, if you'd like.
We used to have that.
Yeah,
we used to have probation periods, but they didn't work. Immigration didn't want to manage those probation periods.
So what happened in the old probation periods? Like, what did they test during this probation period?
Economic attachment to Canada. Have you opened a business as promised? Have you married? We used to have a fiancé program. Did you marry within the set time? Typically, it didn't work, because by the time immigration was challenging you, testing whether or not you'd met the conditions, you'd been here for several years. And you'd set down roots in the community. You'd had maybe children, or your children were living here and had made friends, or you had a job, or you'd started a business and you're hiring Canadians. And so it was counterproductive. By the time they got around to you, it was counterproductive to ask you to go.
So now, like, if you're thinking of to the good old days of, like, back in the 1990s,
well, they weren't necessarily good. They were simpler.
Simpler. Yeah. So isn't that, like, too lenient again? Like, you know,
that system had its teeth too. I'm not saying make the system more liberal. I may say make it more transparent and predictable, and make it simpler so someone can navigate the system without hiring someone like me. There are times that I'm embarrassed that I'm handling a file, because I know they should be able to do it. The substantive questions, the underlying questions are straightforward, but they can't get through the paperwork, the red tape. And I'm also embarrassed to have someone say, and I'm thinking about what's called the express entry system today, the economic category. That is determined by a floating point scale. It fluctuates up and down. So I'm talking to someone, they want to come to Canada, they're working here or have a Canadian education. I'm talking to them and they'll say, do I have a chance? And I'll say, I don't know. And they will invest a lot of money and a lot of heart and a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know because it's changing. And often the rules change without any notice to the public.
It's supply and demand, basically. That's
supply and demand, but I would rather that the system, if I was looking at it on February 20 today, and it was properly resourced and was simpler, that we knew on February 20 whether or not I was going to win or lose.
February 20, 2020.
2020, yeah. I knew whether I was going to win and lose within 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And do I invest my time in the system? Because it's far kinder to say, sir, madam, you don't have a chance.
Okay.
That's my problem as a technician.
And some other people, again, would argue that maybe the system, like the criteria that they use to see who's eligible and who's the right candidate, should be changed a lot, because some people say that there are much better people who applied for Canadian citizenship and they refused, while others who are much less qualified, much less ready to be part of the society were accepted.
Well, are we talking about a family class? Because that's...
Yeah, like a family, or like a just professionals, like skilled workers. So something like age, for instance. Supposedly, I'm older, but I'm much more qualified. So why do you give things to age here? Like what is there something hidden? Is there something between the lines that people are not really saying it?
Well, I'll tell you how the system is biased now, the economic system. Mm-hmm. You mentioned at the beginning the entrepreneur and investor categories.
Yeah.
Those have been gone for years. They're just gone. There are back doors that I can sometimes use, but I will often have a 50-year-old person who owns a factory in China or in Turkey, and they want to set up a factory here and hire Canadians. Mm-hmm. I can't do anything for them most of the time. And that to me is a tragedy, because I'm thinking of all the jobs.
Of course, yeah.
But the system now, I've been criticizing the system, I'm going to give it a compliment. The system now, and I'm speaking as a Canadian, the system now is designed to encourage young people who speak English or French and have a Canadian degree or diploma and have worked at least a year in Canada, which you're allowed to if you have a Canadian degree or diploma. Mm-hmm. Those are the people who win. I call that the golden path.
Okay.
Young, educated, energetic, literate people, those are the people who win under the present system. As a Canadian, I consider those people, when they become a citizen, it's like finding a $100 bill on the road, because we didn't do anything to bring them here. Someone else raised them, someone else paid for the education, and we've got 40 or 50 years of working life out of those people for nothing.
Exactly, and they already have the full Canadian experience.
The system works in that regard. As a Canadian, as someone who wants, when I retire, to have good people around me running the country, I can't think of a better way.
And again, recently, and neighbors to the south are reconsidering things like, citizenship by birth. So,
and we are too.
Yeah,
we are too. Again, it's where do you draw the boundaries? Because I've read the reports they're complaining about birth tourism.
Yeah.
The numbers are small. The absolute numbers are small. The ones I saw in the Globe and Mail were under 100 people a year. Mm-hmm. And we're going to make a radical change just because we think 100 people a year are hurting us. And again, looking at it as a Canadian, so what if that child 18, 20 years from now comes back as a Canadian? Someone else has paid to raise them. Someone else has educated them. Again, it's a found money. But think of it this way. Say if my parents were here as students, or one of my parents was working here and allowed to be here. Why are we disqualifying the child of someone like that, someone who's been here for several years, but only on a temporary basis, like for work or study?
Okay, yeah. Some people might argue this might be a little bit unfair because you're just giving citizenship to the rich children. So
the numbers again are so small. It's I think it is under 100 children a year. And I know that there are complaints they were blocking up the maternity wards in Surrey, BC, but think about the unintended consequences. If you try to stop that, I wonder how many thousands of children will be hurt when really their parents are not birth tourists. They're simply here for some other reason.
Yeah.
Very easy to have really painful unintended consequences if you do that.
And of course, you know, like the Aboriginal people. Mm-hmm. So we have two different stories about them. So one story says that they came from Asia. Mm-hmm. And like 11,000 years ago during the last ice age.
Or more.
Around that,
pushing it back, yeah.
Exactly. So during the last ice age, and they came from, you know, Asia to Alaska and then went down. Now, another story that is very common amongst the Aboriginal people themselves, they say, this never happened. We're always here. We never came from Asia. We're always here. And then when the continental drift happened, like, you know, the very beginning, we just had, you know, like just one big continent in the center of the earth. And then
I think the dinosaurs were running around that time.
Yeah,
that was 65 to 100 million
This is
years
their
ago.
argument here. Okay. And they're saying, no, but the white people are just saying that to say that it's okay. Just like we came from Asia to here, so it's okay for them to come from Europe to here as well. So this is not actually my question, but my question was, like, now it's part of the citizenship, and coming up it'll be part of the oath as well, to recognize the rights of the Aboriginal people or the First Nations. Do you think this is enough, or should there be much more?
Well, that's way outside my pay grade.
But your personal opinion?
I really don't know, because I'm more of a universalist. Mm-hmm. My personal opinion is we're not different, and I don't like to think. I want to respect everyone's differences, mm-hmm. but I don't really think we're different fundamentally. We may have different attitudes, but history tells me, genetics tell me, biology tells me, world religions tell me we're all cousins, if not brothers and sisters.
Okay.
So I can't really comment on that.
And a very common question, like when somebody's filling out their application for citizenship, or again for permanent residence if they're renewing it, who should I go to? Should I just do it on my own if I think I understand the questions? Should I go to a lawyer? Should I go to a settlement counselor? Like,
yeah. If you have a straightforward history, if you've been in Canada, these are mainly based on residence. Where have you physically been? Mm-hmm. If you have a straightforward history, because the forms themselves are not that complicated.
Okay.
If you've been, say, working in Canada, haven't traveled much, and you're not in a hurry, so if it's returned because you missed something, do it yourself. Do it yourself if you're not in a hurry. Mm-hmm. That's one of the cases I genuinely get embarrassed, like a citizenship application, filling out one of those. If someone's been here the whole time, it's because the lawyers charge on an hourly basis. We have to cover overhead. We want to make some money for ourselves, but this is really something you should do yourself or have a friend help. The settlement workers, their hearts are in the right place. They have a lot of experience. I don't have any problem with that. If you're in a hurry or have a complicated travel history, you do need professional help. And we get people all the time, and where I'm reading dozens, if not hundreds, of entry and exit stamps, tearing what little hair I have left. Yeah. You know, switching back from the English to the Arabic or the Chinese. But if you have a simple history, do it yourself, or have a friend do it. It's not worth paying us.
And so we talked a little bit about the flaws in the system. Mm-hmm. Another argument from Canadian citizens, they say, like, you know, charity always starts at home, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you know, you never offer food to a child while your son is hungry. So do all Canadians have jobs right now? Do all Canadians, like, feel that they're fully satisfied for us to open the door to more and more influx of refugees and new immigrants?
Well, the refugees are small. They're a small component. The overseas sponsorship program is as little as under 20,000 people a year.
Mm-hmm.
That's tiny, and we're a wealthy country.
For the people in the GTA, maybe the picture might look different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
because most of the refugees, they tend to come and settle.
Yeah. If you're coming as a family class, there's an undertaking the sponsor pays that, or signs that they're going to look after you. So they should not be a burden. The new people should not be a burden.
Okay.
If you're coming as an economic migrant, there are already all these tests. You have to bring a certain amount of money. You have to have a job already. There's all these tests to screen out for people who can't support themselves. And if you're coming as a refugee, though, like I think of like today it's -4 outside. And I think of someone, say, in a refugee camp, even in Lebanon. Now, -4 is a bit too cold, but or in Turkey. Think of someone in a tent with children, a mud floor, and it's 2 degrees and raining, and you have a pit toilet. Help that person. We're rich. We can't help that person. That's disgusting. It's only 20,000 at most a year.
But people say, yeah, we're rich, but how come again we have unemployment? Like if we're rich, like how come some people are struggling?
Yep. Some people are struggling, but the problem, that family who's in a tent with a mud floor, I think we can afford that. And as I said at the beginning, this has to do with how we see ourselves. I think you mentioned about, will I help someone who's lying in a ditch?
Yeah.
Will I walk by an injured man who's lying in a ditch? Well, that's right in the Bible, the story of the Good Samaritan.
Exactly.
And that is the story we have to remember. The Good Samaritan, 2 other people walked by that man.
from the same background.
From the same background.
As the person, they
and
left him alone.
The Good Samaritan, who is traditionally an enemy.
Yeah, took him to the inn, gave him food, gave him drink, and paid for it.
And we all want to be the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
Even if we're a monk from Cambodia, we all want to be that person.
Definitely. Another thing again is a lot of people, professionals, like especially in the medical field, they've always argued, like, why would you let me here and then ask me to make all the studies? Like they're arguing, like some countries, like Australia, for instance, you can do all the studies before coming to Australia. So if I'm like a physician or a pharmacist, whatnot, why don't you tell me that you have to study this, this, and that? You take the test wherever you are, and then after passing all this, you come to Canada.
You may want to talk to the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons about that, because they're the ones who do it.
So they think there is a lot of lobbying happening there?
I have met foreign professionals who I would not trust exercise their skills.
Oh, okay.
But I know that the licensing is, I agree with you, it could be simplified. It could be made a much easier here.
Yeah, so you think it's lobbying pressure groups? Like
I don't know. I have tried to help professionals, nurses and dentists and pharmacists and doctors navigate the college's requirements over my 30+ years, and usually my patience wears out because of the roadblocks. But I'm not going to say why they do that.
Okay.
I don't know. I wasn't in the room when they made that decision.
Absolutely. Well, like time did really fly, and thank you very much for this.
Oh, it's been fun.
Very fruitful discussion, and would really have the pleasure of having you again if your time allows.
I don't know what I have to say that would be new, though.
Yeah.
Every bird has but one song, and I think you heard mine.
Yeah, but we can think of new songs later on. So Robert Young, thank you very much for being with us. It was a real pleasure having you. Absolutely, same here. And dear listeners and viewers, thank you for having us tonight, as usual. and hoping to meet again coming Thursday, same time. And for Arabic speakers, don't forget our meeting this coming Monday at 6 p.m. Until we meet again, take care and goodbye.